For thousands of years, humanity has told stories about creatures no one had ever truly seen. Winged beasts sleeping beneath mountains. Serpents large enough to swallow kingdoms. Ancient monsters rising from the sea, from storms, from fire itself. Long before castles, long before empires, and perhaps even before written language, the image of the dragon already existed in the human imagination. Almost every civilization created its own version of this creature. In the frozen north, dragons crawled beneath the roots of the world. In the east, they ruled the skies and commanded the rain. In ancient deserts and forgotten temples, giant serpents represented chaos, destruction, and the anger of the gods. Some dragons were worshipped. Others were feared. And many became symbols of humanity's oldest nightmares. But why? Why did people across distant continents imagine such similar creatures? Perhaps dragons were born from the raw power of nature itself. Thunder that shook the earth. Volcanoes breathing fire into the night sky. Massive bones hidden beneath the ground. Or the ancient fear of predators that once hunted early mankind. Over time, the dragon changed. It became a guardian of treasure, a destroyer of kingdoms, a god, a monster, and eventually, one of the greatest symbols of fantasy itself. Today, dragons live everywhere in fiction. In books, games, films, and legends. Sometimes they appear as mindless beasts driven only by hunger. Sometimes as wise and immortal beings older than humanity itself. But no matter their form, dragons never disappeared. Because humanity never stopped looking into the darkness and imagining something enormous staring back. For as long as humanity has existed, dragons have appeared in its myths. Not as simple animals, but as forces connected to creation, destruction, death, storms, oceans, and the unknown itself. The dragon was never just a monster. It was something larger, something ancient, a reflection of the fears and beliefs of entire civilizations. And although cultures across the world imagined dragons differently, many of them shared the same idea: dragons represented powers beyond human control. Some of the oldest dragon-like beings appeared in the myths of Mesopotamia, where the earliest cities rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There, the dragon was tied to chaos itself. One of the oldest examples was Tiamat, a primordial sea goddess often described as a gigantic serpent or dragon-like being. In Babylonian mythology, she represented the endless salt ocean that existed before the world was created. But creation demanded conflict. The storm god Marduk fought Tiamat in a cosmic war. After defeating her, he split her body apart and formed the heavens and the earth from her remains. This idea would echo through countless myths that followed. Order could only exist after chaos was defeated. And chaos often took the shape of a dragon. Across the ancient Near East, giant serpents and dragons guarded forbidden places, sacred knowledge, or gateways to the underworld. They symbolized floods, storms, darkness, and destruction, forces humanity could never fully tame. Even in later traditions, traces of these ancient monsters survived. The biblical Leviathan, the sea serpent of chaos, carried many similarities to earlier dragon myths. Massive, untouchable, and terrifying, Leviathan represented the fear of the endless sea and the unknown depths beneath it. In many ways, the earliest dragons were not creatures living inside the world. They were part of the world itself. Far to the north, dragons became darker creatures. In Norse mythology, dragons were deeply connected to greed, death, and the slow destruction of the world. One of the most terrifying was Nidhogg, a monstrous serpent dragon that gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree holding the cosmos together. While gods fought wars in the heavens, Nidhogg waited below, endlessly chewing at the foundations of existence itself. This was not a noble creature. It was decay, entropy, the inevitable end waiting beneath all things. Northern legends often portrayed dragons as guardians of cursed treasure. Gold was never simply wealth. It carried corruption, obsession, and doom. That idea appears clearly in the story of Fafnir. Once a mortal being, Fafnir became consumed by greed and transformed into a dragon to guard his treasure hoard. In many ways, this became one of the most influential dragon archetypes in Western fantasy, the dragon as a creature twisted by endless desire. Centuries later, that image would inspire countless stories, including the dragons of modern fantasy literature. In the cold myths of the North, dragons were not majestic rulers of the skies. They were symbols of corruption hidden beneath civilization. While Western cultures often feared dragons, Eastern traditions saw them very differently. In China, dragons became symbols of wisdom, balance, prosperity, and heavenly power. Unlike the winged fire-breathing beasts of Europe, Chinese dragons were long, serpent-like creatures that moved through clouds, rivers, storms, and the skies themselves. They were connected to rain and agriculture, the very survival of entire kingdoms. A dragon could bring storms, but also life. For centuries, Chinese emperors associated themselves with dragons as symbols of divine authority. The creature represented harmony between heaven and earth, power guided by wisdom rather than destruction. In many Eastern myths, dragons were not enemies to be slain. They were ancient beings deserving respect. Japan, Korea, and other Asian cultures developed their own dragon traditions as well. Some lived deep beneath the ocean. Others guarded sacred rivers, mountains, or hidden realms. Many could shapeshift or move between worlds. And unlike the monsters of Western legends, Eastern dragons often possessed patience, intelligence, and spiritual understanding far beyond humanity. Two civilizations looked at the same mythical creature and saw completely different meanings. Dragon-like beings also appeared far beyond Europe and Asia. In Mesoamerican mythology, one of the most famous was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent worshipped by the Aztecs and earlier civilizations. Unlike the destructive dragons of many Western legends, Quetzalcoatl was associated with knowledge, wind, creation, and civilization itself. Part serpent, part divine being, part cosmic force. The image of the serpent rising into the heavens appeared again and again across ancient American cultures. Elsewhere in the world, dragon-like creatures took many forms. In Africa, enormous serpents were often tied to rivers, rain, and spiritual power. In Australian Aboriginal mythology, the rainbow serpent shaped the land itself during the Dreamtime. Across Slavic folklore, multi-headed dragons terrorized villages and battled legendary heroes. Different names, different shapes, different meanings, and yet the pattern remained strangely familiar. Again and again, humanity imagined gigantic reptilian beings connected to forces greater than itself. Storms, oceans, fire, death, the heavens, and the deep places beneath the earth. Perhaps dragons survived in mythology for one simple reason. They allowed ancient people to give shape to the chaos of the world around them.
If this video resonates with you, leave a sign, give it a like and share your things in the comment. Pass into other. Let more people discover this world. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about new realities, myths, and otherworldly realms. The story is only beginning. So, I'm curious, which narration feels more immersive to you? A human voice, my voice, with very bad English, or an AI voice? Share your judgment in the comments. This was Atlas of World Between the Page. Bye. See other my videos.
As civilizations changed, so did dragons. The ancient forces of chaos worshipped by early cultures slowly transformed into something far more personal, monsters that heroes were destined to fight. By the Middle Ages, the dragon had become the ultimate enemy. It no longer represented only storms or the sea. Now it symbolized greed, destruction, sin, and fear itself. Across Europe, stories of dragon slayers began to spread through legends, religious tales, and epic poetry. Knights battled fire-breathing beasts to save kingdoms. Saints defeated serpents as symbols of divine victory over evil. Entire villages lived in terror beneath the shadow of creatures sleeping inside mountains or hidden deep within caves. The dragon became a test, a challenge standing between humanity and survival. One of the most famous examples was the legend of St. George and the Dragon. In the story, a monstrous dragon terrorized a kingdom, demanding sacrifices from the people. When the creature was finally given a princess as tribute, St. George arrived and confronted the beast. The tale spread across Europe for centuries, becoming one of the defining images of medieval mythology. A lone warrior facing an ancient horror. But beneath the surface, the story carried deeper meaning. The dragon represented chaos, paganism, temptation, and the darkness that civilization believed it had conquered. Killing the dragon was not simply survival. It was the triumph of order over fear. This idea appeared again and again in medieval literature. In the ancient epic of the aging hero faces a dragon guarding a treasure hoard. The creature is awakened when a single cup is stolen from its cave, unleashing destruction upon the land. The dragon is not portrayed as misunderstood or noble. It is wrath incarnate, a force that burns kingdoms and destroys everything around it. And yet, even in these early stories, dragons were becoming more than mindless beasts. They were intelligent, ancient, cunning. They spoke, planned, remembered, and hated. Over time, this image evolved into what many people today recognize as the classic Western dragon. Massive wings, burning breath, armored scales, and endless greed for gold. No writer shaped this image more than Tolkien introduced one of the most iconic dragons in fantasy history. Smaug was not merely a monster guarding treasure. He was intelligent, manipulative, arrogant, and terrifyingly aware of his own power. Hidden beneath the lonely mountain, surrounded by stolen gold, Smaug became the perfect embodiment of greed and destruction. His voice alone carried menace. His presence transformed entire kingdoms into ruins. And unlike many earlier dragons, Smaug felt alive as a character. Modern fantasy would never be the same after him. Tolkien's influence spread across books, games, films, and eventually nearly every corner of fantasy culture. The image of the dragon sleeping atop treasure became deeply embedded in modern storytelling. But dragons also reflected another fear growing inside human imagination: the fear of unstoppable destruction. As centuries passed, dragons became larger and more catastrophic. Entire cities burned beneath their shadows. Armies collapsed before their fire. The creature that once symbolized ancient chaos had now become the ultimate fantasy weapon. And yet, despite their terrifying nature, dragons fascinated people more than ever. Because unlike ordinary monsters, dragons felt powerful in a way that seemed almost divine. They ruled the skies. They outlived kingdoms. They stood above humanity itself. In many stories, facing a dragon became more than a battle. It became a confrontation with death, fear, greed, and the unknown. And perhaps that is why dragons survived while so many other mythical creatures faded away. They were never simply animals. They were the embodiment of humanity's greatest nightmares, given wings, fire, and an immortal form. By the 20th century, dragons began to change once again. Fantasy literature was evolving. Worlds became larger, more detailed, and morally complex. Monsters were no longer simply evil creatures waiting to be slain by heroes. And dragons transformed with them. Writers started asking new questions. What if dragons could think like humans? What if they possessed wisdom older than civilization itself? What if humanity feared them not because they were beasts, but because they were superior? Slowly, dragons stopped being simple monsters. They became characters. One of the biggest changes in modern fantasy was the idea that humans and dragons could coexist. Not as enemies, but as companions, partners, and even friends. This concept became especially powerful in stories where dragons formed deep bonds with riders. Instead of knights hunting dragons, heroes now flew beside them. Dragons were intelligent creatures genetically connected to humanity. Riders communicated with them telepathically, sharing thoughts, emotions, and memories. The relationship was built on trust rather than domination. For many readers, this completely changed the emotional image of dragons. They were no longer distant horrors hidden inside mountains. They became loyal companions capable of sacrifice, affection, and understanding. Later fantasy continued this idea. The bond between dragon and rider became central to the story. Dragons were portrayed as ancient, emotional, and deeply intelligent beings whose connection with humans could shape the fate of entire kingdoms. Flight itself became part of the fantasy. To ride a dragon meant freedom, power, adventure beyond the limits of the ordinary world. And audiences loved it. Over time, dragons evolved into symbols not only of fear, but also of wonder. As fantasy worlds became more sophisticated, dragons began to resemble ancient civilizations rather than animals. Some writers imagined them as beings older than humanity itself, creatures who witnessed the rise and fall of empires long before humans built their first cities. In many stories, dragons possessed knowledge beyond mortal understanding. They spoke forgotten languages, guarded ancient magic, remembered truths lost to history. Dragons are deeply connected to the old speech, the true language of creation itself. Their names carry immense power, and their understanding of the world reaches far beyond human limitations. Here, dragons are not servants of the plot. They feel ancient, alien, almost godlike. This idea spread across fantasy literature, role-playing games, and modern media. Dragons became philosophers, rulers, sorcerers, and immortal observers watching younger races struggle through history. Sometimes they appeared wise and noble, sometimes proud and terrifying. But they were rarely simple creatures anymore. The dragon had become something much larger, a rival civilization existing beside humanity. And in many fantasy worlds, humans were no longer the dominant species. Modern fantasy also explored another terrifying possibility. What happens when dragons become instruments of war? In ancient mythology, dragons often represented natural disasters. But in modern fantasy, they increasingly resembled living weapons of mass destruction. No series demonstrated this more clearly than. In this world, dragons are not noble protectors or mystical guides. They are terrifying forces capable of deciding wars, destroying armies, and reshaping political power overnight. Entire dynasties rise because of dragons. Entire kingdoms fall because of them. The Targaryens conquered continents from the backs of dragons, turning fire into imperial authority. And unlike traditional fantasy creatures, these dragons feel dangerous in a disturbingly realistic way. Cities burn. Soldiers panic. Nothing can stand against them. The dragon here is not merely fantasy. It is absolute power. Modern audiences immediately understood the symbolism. A dragon flying above a battlefield feels less like mythology, and more like humanity's eternal obsession with creating weapons too powerful to control. This darker interpretation spread into countless fantasy settings, games, and films. Dragons became biological superweapons, ancient engines of destruction, living symbols of empire, conquest, and fear. And yet, despite all these changes, one thing remained constant. Whether feared, worshipped, loved, or controlled, dragons always stood above humanity. Larger than kings, older than nations, and powerful enough to change the fate of entire worlds. Fantasy has never stopped reinventing dragons. The ancient beast from myth survived into modern storytelling because it could become almost anything. As fantasy worlds grew darker, stranger, and more experimental, dragons evolved far beyond their traditional forms. Some became undead abominations raised by forbidden magic. Others transformed into machines of steel and fire. And some abandoned fantasy entirely, becoming cosmic entities drifting through space and dimensions beyond human understanding. The dragon was no longer limited to caves and mountains. It had entered every corner of imagination. Among the most terrifying versions of dragons are the undead. These creatures combine two ancient fears into one: the fear of massive predators, and the fear of death itself. In dark fantasy, dragon graveyards often become places of forbidden power. Necromancers, liches, and dark sorcerers attempt to raise the remains of ancient dragons, turning legendary creatures into monstrous servants of undeath. The result is horrifying. Gigantic skeletons rise from ruined battlefields. Rotting wings spread across poisoned skies. Dead eyes burn with unnatural green fire. Unlike living dragons, undead dragons often feel empty, stripped of instinct, emotion, or mercy. They exist only to destroy. In many fantasy settings inspired by tabletop worlds like dungeons, undead dragons became popular because they transformed dragons from fantasy creatures into horror icons. Their presence changes entire landscapes. Kingdoms collapse around them. The air itself feels cursed. They represent corruption in its purest form. Life refusing to die. And in many ways, they reflect one of humanity's oldest fears: that death itself may not be the end. As fantasy collided with steampunk and science fiction, dragons changed again. This time, scales became armor plates. Bones became gears and engines. Fire became smoke, steam, and machinery. Mechanical dragons emerged as symbols of industrial power and technological obsession. One of the most famous examples appears in where dragons are horrifying biomechanical war machines created inside dark factories. These dragons are not noble creatures of nature. They are built, manufactured for war, destruction, and control. This radically changed the symbolism of dragons. Ancient dragons represented wild power beyond humanity's reach. Mechanical dragons represented something far more disturbing: humanity creating monsters with its own hands. In steampunk fantasy, iron dragons often thunder through smoke-filled skies powered by steam engines and blackened furnaces. Chains, pistons, gears, and molten metal replace scales and flesh. Some resemble living battleships. Others look like flying factories. And unlike mythical dragons tied to magic or nature, mechanical dragons feel cold and artificial. They are weapons. This idea became especially powerful in modern fantasy because it mirrors real-world fears about technology. As civilizations advanced, people began imagining machines growing too powerful to control. The dragon adapted perfectly to that fear. No longer an ancient beast sleeping beneath a mountain, but a machine capable of destroying entire cities. Mechanical dragons also blurred the line between fantasy and science fiction. They proved that dragons could survive even in worlds dominated by industry and technology. The myth evolved. Again. Some fantasy creators pushed dragons even further. Beyond kingdoms. Beyond planets. Beyond reality itself. Cosmic dragons transformed the ancient creature into something almost incomprehensible. These beings are not simply giant reptiles flying through space. In many stories, they are older than stars, civilizations, and even time itself. Some drift through galaxies like living constellations. Others sleep inside black holes or feed on the energy of dying suns. Their scales may resemble entire nebulae. Their voices may echo across dimensions. At this point, the dragon becomes less of an animal and more of a cosmic force. In modern fantasy and science fiction, interdimensional dragons often exist outside normal reality. They move between worlds, timelines, or universes as if crossing invisible doors. To humanity, they appear almost godlike. Not because they rule kingdoms, but because human minds can barely comprehend them. These dragons are deeply connected to cosmic horror. The fear no longer comes from teeth or fire. It comes from scale. A medieval dragon could destroy a castle. A cosmic dragon could consume worlds. Some stories portray them as guardians of reality itself. Others describe them as ancient beings sleeping beyond existence, waiting for entire universes to die. And yet, despite becoming increasingly strange and abstract, these creatures still remain recognizable as dragons. That is the remarkable thing about the archetype. The dragon survives every transformation. It can become undead horror, industrial machine, alien god, living weapon, or cosmic nightmare. Few mythical creatures possess that flexibility. Perhaps that is why dragons never disappeared from fantasy. They evolve alongside human fears and dreams. Every era creates the dragons it needs. Thousands of years have passed since the first dragon myths appeared. Empires rose and vanished. Religions changed. Civilizations collapsed into dust. And yet dragons survived them all. Very few mythical creatures have remained as powerful inside human imagination for so long. Many ancient monsters faded into obscurity, remembered only by historians or forgotten legends. But dragons never disappeared. Instead, they evolved. In ancient times, dragons represented chaos and the terrifying forces of nature. Storms, floods, fire, darkness, and the endless sea were beyond human control, and the dragon gave those fears a shape. Later, in medieval legends, dragons became symbols of evil, greed, and destruction. Heroes proved themselves by facing creatures larger and more terrifying than ordinary men could possibly overcome. Then fantasy transformed dragons again. They became wise beings, ancient races, companions, rulers, gods, weapons, and even cosmic entities drifting between stars. Every generation reinvented them, and perhaps that is the reason dragons endure. They are not tied to a single meaning. A dragon can represent fear, or freedom, wisdom, power, death, magic, war, mystery. It changes depending on what humanity sees inside it. That flexibility allowed dragons to survive every age of storytelling. When people feared the wilderness, dragons lived in mountains and dark forests. When kingdoms feared invasion and destruction, dragons burned cities and armies. When fantasy became more philosophical, dragons became ancient intelligences older than humanity itself. Even today, dragons continue to evolve. In films, books, games, and modern mythology, they still appear again and again, sometimes terrifying, sometimes majestic, sometimes tragic. But they are never ordinary. Because dragons awaken something ancient inside human imagination. Perhaps they remind us of the unknown forces that once dominated the world before civilization existed. Perhaps they embody humanity's obsession with power. Or perhaps people simply want to believe that somewhere beyond the horizon, something enormous and impossible still waits. The dragon also survives because it exists perfectly between terror and wonder. Most monsters are meant only to frighten. Dragons do more than that. People fear them, but they also admire them. A dragon soaring through the sky represents absolute freedom. Its size and power make humans feel small, yet at the same time fascinated. That mixture of awe and fear gives dragons a unique place in fantasy. They are not simply beasts. They are living symbols of the impossible. And no matter how much the world changes, humanity continues searching for the impossible. That is why dragons never truly vanished. As long as people look into storms, into darkness, into the stars, and imagine something ancient staring back, dragons will survive.
Perhaps dragon never truly existed. No ancient beast may have ever risen from the sea or descended from the clouds in fire and shadow, and yet humanity has carried their image from thousands of years. From forgotten temples and medieval legends to fantasy worlds, distant galaxy, and modern imagination, dragon extruded. Because they became more than creatures, they became simple symbols of everything humanity feels and everything humanity dreams about: power, mystery, freedom, destruction, immortality. And, per- and perhaps somewhere deep inside you, We still want to believe that the world holds something ancient and impossible beyond the age of the known. And as long as humanity continues looking into the darkness ever with wonder, dragon never die. If this video resonates with you, leave a sign, give it a like and share your things in the comment. Pass into other. Let more people discover this world. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about new realities, myths, and otherworldly realms. The story is only beginning. So, I'm curious, which narration feels more immersive to you? A human voice, my voice, with very bad English, or an AI voice? Share your judgment in the comments. This was Atlas of World Between the Page. Bye. See other my videos.